You know, some conflicts don't just end. They create shockwaves that ripple out for decades. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a war that didn't just help end the Cold War, but in many ways shaped the world we live in right now.
And right there, that quote tells you almost everything you need to know about the Cold War mindset. The moment Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, America's top security advisor wasn't just thinking about defense, he was thinking about offense. He saw a chance to trap the Soviets in a bloody, unwinnable war. But here's the twist. This whole story doesn't start with an invasion. It actually starts with a friendship.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising, but before all the chaos, the USSR and Afghanistan were actually really close. Moscow was its biggest economic partner, and for the Soviets, Afghanistan was this perfect buffer state, sitting right between them, Iran, and China. Things were stable.
So check out this paradox. In April of 1978, a group of Afghan communists, led by a guy named Nur Muhammad Taraki, seized power in a violent coup. Now, you'd think the Kremlin would be popping the champagne, right? A new communist neighbor. But no. They were absolutely furious. This messy, ill-timed revolution had just completely destabilized their very important and very friendly neighbor.
The new communist government in Kabul didn't waste any time. They tried to force a deeply traditional feudal society into a modern socialist state literally overnight, and it was a total disaster. These reforms sparked violent uprisings all over the country, like a really bloody rebellion in the city of Herat in March 1979. So, a panicked President Taraki gets on the phone with the Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, and he is practically begging him to send in troops. But Kosygin just shuts him down. He knew exactly what it would look like. He could already see the headlines, and he wanted absolutely no part of an invasion.
And to make things even more chaotic, there was this intense power struggle brewing. Because while Taraki was the president, the guy really pulling the strings was his prime minister, Hafizullah Amin. And Amin was, well, he was ambitious, he was ruthless, and Moscow saw him as dangerously unpredictable. And then everything shatters. Amin has his own president, his own comrade Taraki, murdered, suffocated with pillows, and he takes absolute power. For the Soviets, who were already deeply paranoid, this was terrifying. They start wondering, is this guy secretly a CIA agent? We can't control him. And that, for them, was the biggest threat of all.
So here's the crucial point. The decision to invade wasn't some grand strategic plan. It was made by a tiny handful of old-guard Soviet leaders, and the primary goal was just to get rid of Amin. And get this, the actual order was scribbled on a single piece of handwritten paper, giving them permission to take necessary measures in, and I quote, Country A. That's how this whole thing started.
So on December 27, 1979, 100,000 Soviet soldiers pour into Afghanistan, and what had been a messy civil war was about to explode into a global conflict.
For U.S. President Jimmy Carter, this wasn't just geopolitics. He felt personally betrayed by the Soviet leader, Brezhnev, who he thought had lied to him. So he immediately authorized a secret CIA program. It was called Operation Cyclone, and its mission was simple: secretly arm the Afghan resistance, the fighters known as the Mujahideen.
And the way they set up this proxy war was actually kind of genius. You had money flowing in from the US and Saudi Arabia. That money went to Pakistan's incredibly powerful secret service, the ISI. They handled all the dirty work, the training, the logistics, getting the weapons to the fighters. It was the perfect way to fight the Soviets with zero American boots on the ground.
Now, the invasion of a Muslim country by a state-sponsored atheist government completely changed the game. The local resistance transformed into a global cause. The fight was declared a jihad, a holy war, and it started attracting foreign fighters from all over the Muslim world, including a young, very wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The war very quickly bogged down into this brutal, grinding stalemate. But a new administration was taking over in Washington, and America's role in this fight was about to get a whole lot bigger. Yeah, when Ronald Reagan came into office, the whole objective changed. His CIA director, Bill Casey, looked at the situation and basically said, "We're not just here to harass the Soviets anymore, to give them their own Vietnam. No, the new goal was much simpler. Let's go win this thing." And they were willing to spend whatever it took. In 1986, Casey went to the operative in charge of the program and offered him $1 billion to get the job done. Think about that, $1 billion in 1986 money. It was an absolutely staggering amount. So where did some of that money go? Well, it went to a weapon that completely changed the war, the Stinger missile. This thing was incredible.
You could fire it from your shoulder, it would lock onto the heat from a Soviet helicopter or a jet, and it would just take it out of the sky. It neutralized the Red Army's single biggest advantage, their air power.
And the impact was immediate and devastating. As soon as the Mujahideen got their hands on Stingers, Soviet helicopters just started falling out of the sky. The losses went through the roof. You could feel the tide of the entire war starting to turn.
So as the battlefield was turning against them, the political will back in Moscow was starting to crumble too. The disastrous war, combined with a major crisis at the very top of the Soviet government, was creating the perfect storm for a withdrawal.
I mean, just look at this timeline. Between 1982 and 1985, 3 different Soviet leaders died in office. The Kremlin was basically a revolving door of funerals. And all of that chaos ended when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, a new kind of leader who looked at this catastrophic war and knew it had to end.
And the human cost? It's almost impossible to comprehend. Over the decade of war, it's estimated that more than 1.2 million Afghans were killed. The vast majority of them were just civilians caught in the middle of a superpower conflict.
The Red Army officially lost 15,000 soldiers, and that number sent shockwaves through Soviet society. It fueled a powerful anti-war movement back home that the government just couldn't ignore anymore.
And then there's this number, 6 million. 6 million Afghans became refugees. That was nearly half of the country's entire pre-war population, forced to flee their homes, leaving behind a nation that was just completely in ruins.
So when you boil it all down, the war left behind these 2 enormous, world-changing legacies. First, the humiliating defeat was a massive factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And second, the war created the perfect breeding ground, the perfect training camp for a global jihadist movement that would very soon turn its sights on the West.
Which leaves us with this one final, haunting question from the source material. A war that America helped fight to win the Cold War instead became the starting point for yet another war, the outcome of which no one yet knows. A tragic consequence that we are all in one way or another still living with today.